Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And it's the beginning of an Eastern Front week, but it's not just battles. We're looking at various aspects of the Eastern Front area and campaign. Anyway, we've also been looking at the Baltic area recently, and we're doing that again on Thursday with Bastian Willems, is talking about the East Prussia offensive. But right now, though, we have Holly Harris back to talk about the POW experience in that area. So I'm delighted to bring her in. So it's good morning where she is, afternoon where I'm. Good morning. How are you today, Holly?
I'm great. How are you, Paul?
I'm good, thanks. So we were just chatting before going live about conferences and public speaking, and what have you been up to since we last spoke? Because you're kind of on a different rung of the ladder to some of the guests. You're kind of feeling your way through history. What have you been up to?
Yeah, I have been definitely feeling my way through history. I'm just finishing up my first year of my Ph.D. program at Southern Methodist University. Very blessed. I've spoken at a few conferences in the fall, be speaking at the Society for Military History in Arlington, Virginia next week. And this summer, I will be learning Russian, courtesy of the State Department. And I will also be doing research with the United States Holocaust Museum in DC and working on an edited collection about the US military and the Holocaust with a really incredible group of professors led by Adam Seep. So those are some fun things coming up.
That's pretty cool. And language is so important. Right? It's one of the difficulties of my early era is I had no access to foreign archives as a teenager and in my 20s in history. I mean, we had no internet back then, it was books. And now the ability to converse with historians around the world, and archives are opening up, and Google Translate and DeepL and stuff, and then learning languages, the access to a variety of sources is really important. And we're going to be talking about sources, I guess, in your talk today. So anyway, I'll bring up your slide. So folks, you know the score. We'll kind of deal with questions that are pertaining to the slide as we're going through it. Any kind of big, broader ones about the broader subject of POWs or the experience, we'll do them at the end. But I'm going to hand off to Holly to take us through this subject, which is something I know very little about.
Thank you, Paul, for that great introduction. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. So today I will be talking about the Allied prisoner of war experience from Stalag 1A mainly, although it's similar to Stalag 1B, because those are the two prisoner of war camps in East Prussia. And I will refer to prisoners of war as POWs, just to make that extra clear. So what is this presentation about? It's mainly going to focus on the French, Belgium, and sometimes Luxembourgish prisoners of war. Everyone else will be seen as a kind of quote unquote other, including the Germans, the Russians, and the Jewish people. Additionally, what I think makes this presentation really special is that in addition to all the nitty gritty of kind of the fall of East Prussia and the Allied POW experience, the scope of the presentation will cover 50 years from the POW captivity to their experiences after the war until the 1990s. So I hope that you are all able to stick around for the presentation and join me on this decades-long intergenerational journey. And one last note before I get this started, the sources for this presentation come from the Clark-Yudkin Special Collections at the United States Air Force Academy, where I was fortunate enough to be awarded a fellowship by the Friends of the Air Force Academy. And so they have a massive collection with over 500 issues of a newspaper called Sudu 1A, which is the experience of the men of Stalag 1A during the war and then also after.
Brilliant.
So a quick overview, I will be talking about Stalag 1A, and then I'll be talking about the Battle of Königsberg, and then after captivity. So the first question I want to get out of the way, or at least address, is why should we care about these Allied POWs in East Prussia and specifically Stalag 1A? And what's really interesting is that the POWs asked themselves this question long after the war. In a 1967 newspaper article, they said, is it really necessary to speak again? And at all hours that we live there, do we have the right, some will say the duty, to maintain such a memory? Hasn't everything been said about the prisoners of war that were there? So do we have the right to be proud of these years lost behind barbed wire? Shouldn't we rather keep quiet? And that was said in 1967, long before a whole slew of prisoner of war historiography and research has been done. So just while I'm talking, I thought that was a poignant quote to keep in mind throughout. And of course, I will address that more directly at the end of the presentation. And I hope that the one big takeaway that you can leave this presentation with is knowing how these men, these prisoners of war, make sense of suffering and this incredibly transnational experience that war is, and also remembrance. There's a lot of personal anecdotes about, nations sometimes having transnational friendships, but it's really through these POWs at Stalag 1A that we can really prove this statement and see it on a much larger scale. So first off, I just want to give a quick overview of the camp. It was in Königsberg, East Prussia, which is modern-day Kaliningrad, Russia. Stalag 1A was one of the largest prisoner of war camps in World War II, yet it is also one of the least documented camps in the prisoner of war literature. Stalag 1A was one of the biggest POW camps with over 60,000 men. This is around 30,000 Russians, 23,000 Belgians, and 8,000 French POWs interned here. The camp was opened on September 6, 1939 by the Wehrmacht, and it was closed on January 25th, 1945 during the whole East Prussian offensive and exodus. The camp was responsible for at least 21 prisoner labor detachments outside the camp. And of course, there was also Prussian prisoners of war and Jewish prisoners, and the French and Belgian POWs were brought into the fold, of course, from the Nazi invasion of Western Europe in the spring of 1940. And so they're kind of also a unique set of the POW experience because their captivity is 5 years long versus American POWs. Most of them, their captivity was less than a year because greater than 50% became a prisoner of war that last year of the war versus these French and Belgians with their 5-year-long captivity.
A quick question for you, Holly.
Yes.
I don't interrupt too much, but do you think we all have a bit of a national view of the POW camps generally? We kind of, the Brits think of the British in their camps and Americans in their camps, and we kind of overlook the fact, as you're going to be talking about, there were lots of people all in together from different countries, who've been captured different parts and treated differently by their captors.
Yeah, of course. No, and I think that's a really easy pitfall for all of history to fall into, is this nationalistic theory when in reality nation states are relatively new. And we can even see with all the decolonization after World War II that the nation is very much a concept up for the taking, up for the grabs, up for the construction. And so with the prisoners of war, it's easy for people to think, oh, men are dying for France, they're dying for Belgium, they're dying for all these nations. But we can forget at the end of the day that, these are people. And when you're in a camp, it's not here's the French, here's the Belgians, it's everyone's in here together. And, luckily a lot of them can speak French so they can all communicate. And it's just a really mixing transnational experience of POW camps where they also have agency to choose who they want to associate with. And then not to go on too much of a rant, but, prisoners of war often offered to join the auxiliary groups for the German army. So, not everyone gets that offer, but you could potentially go fight for the Axis if you so wished, or be used in more subversive measures. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah. And then in regards to labor, kind of one thing I'll point out is that only the officers and the non-commissioned officers didn't have to work or labor in the POW camps. Most people, like the men at Stalag 1A, were required to work, and this was perfectly legitimate per the Geneva Conventions. And this labor was very key for the German military machine. And so the POWs at Stalag 1A, they were working as agricultural laborers, they were working in the port, they were working in the railway, they were just key, very critical parts to the German military industrial complex. And then one kind of last thing about what makes Stalag 1A unique that I would be kind of remiss not to talk about is that a lot of these French and Belgian POWs were Catholic versus in Stalag Luft 3 or kind of all the other British and American camps where they were Protestant or atheist. And so being Catholic, they also were very fortunate to have priests, which were kind of key leaders during their spiritual time throughout captivity and also long after the war. And once again, this kind of religion will somewhat play a role in how they frame their suffering and deal with it. And then here's some drawings made by some POWs after the war. So one kind of person who I thought was really interesting from Stalag 1A, I'll call him the gravedigger, was Joseph Savour. And Joseph ends up being a gravedigger for 10 months for Stalag 1A. And I don't know how many times we get the gravedigger experience recorded in history, especially for mass graves. But I just thought his perspective on what that whole ordeal was like, which he keeps in a diary, was incredibly unique. So anyway, so he works a 10-month stint in a 12-man grave digging team for Klein-Dixon. And this Klein-Dixon cemetery is going to be critical for how the POWs make sense and remember their experience after the war. So this is kind of a key touchstone moment and location. And Joseph writes on his first day of grave digging, "I entered last into the hospital room of the POW camp. I was afraid and ashamed of being afraid. I would have liked to flee. The spectacle was so overwhelming, and the smell, bland, lukewarm, captivating, and penetrating. My hesitations were quickly cut short. A piece of the stretcher was thrown at me, and it barely reached the edge of the planks when 2 corpses were already being thrown onto it." So just kind of an extraordinary account. And the picture on the right of the slide is actually Joseph drew later what the layout of the Klein-Dixon cemetery was like. And it's really incredible that we have a road to Calvary that cuts down the people the Germans deemed worthy races and not worthy races. So to the right, we have all the individual graves of French and Belgium POWs who died during their captivity. And to the left, we have the mass graves for the Russians. And then along the perimeter, we also have the graves for the Polish civilians that were shot and killed. And Joseph also recounts when he was digging a trench and then discovered kind of these mass graves of the Polish civilians. And he was like, am I going to have to cut them in 2 to dig this trench? What's the plan? And it's kind of just these remarkable logistics of grave digging that I'd never really considered. And the mental gymnastics also of the German cemetery designer to be like, we can acknowledge God and put a road to Calvary, but we're also going to be doing these kind of mass graves and deaths really kind of speaks to these, how far some people had gone in the ideology and how people could accept it.
Justifying certain aspects by
Yes.
then ignoring them elsewhere when it's convenient. Yeah. Well, that's interesting you mentioned that, Holly, because that's coming up on Wednesday with David Harrisville, who's looking at just how Nazi was the average German soldier, and the answer is going to be it's complicated because as it's in this case that this ideology on one hand, and yet trying to find reasons to justify what you're doing on the other. It's complicated. Thank you for that. It's not no, we've not done much about grave digging on World War II, but I think you're the first to actually talk about it on the channel.
Yeah, well, you got to think about draining, it's kind of what I learned. You can't let the graves flood, and that can be a very messy experience.
Yep.
And also, I'll say I've never seen an intentionally designed cemetery at a POW camp, so that's also quite remarkable. So like I said, this is kind of a main touchstone moment. And then one of the chaplains at the camp keeps a very detailed account of the death toll that is done at the cemetery. So around 4,000 Russians are buried there, 200 French, and then around 100 Belgians. And then, of course, there's a picture at the top right. So next, I will turn to the East Prussian offensive, which is obviously divided into 2 waves for historians. And I'll be focusing on more the second one from January 13th to April 25th of 1945. So I just want to do a quick operational recap of the significance of the city Königsberg, which is where Stalag 1A is. I know that you had historian Nicole Ian on recently, and her work is super illuminating on the city, so I won't venture too far into it, but it's obviously home of Immanuel Kant, and it was the coronation city for the Prussian monarchy for hundreds of years. And then I also want to quickly address, why are the Germans still fighting in 1945? I know that's also a common question, which is, why are we still dealing with these POWs here? Why not, just hand them over to the Russians? Why still quickly care about their logistics? Like, why do the Germans care so much? So there are 3 theories that are offered by history. The first one is a rather unsatisfying kind of personalist explanation that Hitler was so incredibly charismatic and mesmerizing that the Germans were going to fight to the end. Other scholars say that the role of ideology in the National Socialist indoctrination was at the very heart of Germany's prolonged resistance. And, others say that the best explanation is the army's distinct Prussian military culture. And I also would agree with that. And that explains why the Germans are still fighting. And then, of course, we'll also see through this presentation that the clean Wehrmacht myth that the historiography is so clearly disputed is certainly not true. The German army killed its way east and then did so back again west with the whole offensive. And just one last thing on the kind of this Prussian tradition is they had the concept of Totenry or death ride, and that remained really prevalent. And, even a famous commander, Prince Frederick Charles, in the Franco-Prussian War said, "You aren't beaten until that you feel that you are." And I didn't have that feeling. And well, many Germans did not either. So even when it's Christmas of 44, the Germans are still obviously fought many tough battles at Arm, Aachen, Lorraine, and the Hürtgen Forest, and kind of reestablish a position on the Siegfried Line. So that we're going to keep seeing this through in 1945. And the Allied POWs are unfortunately also going to be here trying to see through this incredible hardship and also be in kind of the midst of all this kind of death and destruction. And then Königsberg also is interesting because it really represents Hitler's fortress theory. And the fortresses were supposed to be the stronghold stocked with food and ammunition in order to resist the offensive position of the Allies. And then I'll just kind of change the map so we can see this easily. And so here's a picture of the Königsberg and kind of the offensives. And it's, mainly the Belarusian fronts that would spend 2 months laying siege to the city. And while Hitler's generals had always dismissed fortress strategy as maybe not the best option, Königsberg showed that it certainly could yield results. After all, 5 worn-down German divisions contained 4 Soviet armies, which is quite astonishing. And a lot of this is due to this kind of 19th century fort outer ring, which is shown. But also the POWs of Stalag 1A dug many trenches, as they were preparing for this siege. So once again, kind of showing the role of this POW labor, we kind of think of them as passive or inactive, but they were very much involved in the fighting and the fronts and all that. And so East Prussia had to be taken one chunk at a time. Okay. And so the day, kind of the main day, I'm going to give an overview of the offensive by the Red Air Force around April 1st. They have 5,000 guns and mortars together with 300 rocket launchers. And they also have many large caliber guns, including guns ranging from 203 millimeters to 305. And so there's just a ton of artillery bombardment that's happening while the Stalag 1A POWs are inside the city.
And just to add, Holly, it's also, well, you said yourself, there's a certain symbolism about that part of the Baltic as well, isn't it? In that it's got ties to the east, it's got ties to the kind of Scandinavia, it's got ties to the west, it's got the Prussian aspect. And so rather like the Battle of Stalingrad, where it became about kind of the name of the city as much as the resources and everything else, there's an element of the same thing there, isn't it? One empire is collapsing elsewhere, or has already collapsed, the Nazi empire by early 1945 in some areas, but yet this is still, as you said, there a kind of bastion of the ideology as well as the defensive strategy. So it's, and I think everybody watching will agree, it's an area of the war we know little about. Generally, it's we kind of focus on further south and further east and west as well, and this Baltic, because it's complicated, because it is complicated. I think.
Yeah. That's a beautiful summary. And yeah, the symbolism is rife and the metaphor is incredible. And also the additional irony that, so many of the German tactics were encirclement, right? This cauldron technique to finish off their enemies. And then here we have the Soviets doing the exact same thing to the Germans, right? And ultimately taking their precious stronghold. So I just love that irony as well. And then also, as the map shows, there's the Friedhof Bay. And so a lot of people are trying to escape through there, however, including the POWs. However, it's frozen. And so this kind of exodus on this ice of the Friedhof will be kind of the second touchstone moment for these POWs. One former POW recalls that while post-war circumstances did not allow him to return to the Frischneren, he's convinced that during certain winter nights in severe cold, one can hear the voices there where thousands of innocent victims pierce the immense carpet of snow above the forests and the glaciers in the Baltic, proclaiming in the face of human conscience the shame of so many crimes which have remained unpunished. Just quite a chilling quote, because in addition to the Allied POWs here, we also have the Stutthof concentration camp. And I really think anyone who's looking at POW camps, especially during this last exodus in 1945, it's really hard to ignore the element of the Holocaust that is here after all. The Germans established over 44,000 camps and incarceration sites between 1933 to 1945. And so the fact is that, you know, during this exodus, many POWs will be witnesses to the Holocaust and kind of see these atrocities that are happening and these blatant killings that the Germans are still carrying out during these final days. And so there was around 50,000 prisoners from the Stutthof concentration camp at the time that were also trying to leave Königsberg. And one POW recalls seeing the victims of Stutthof saying, "Poor innocent victims of Stutthof, your image will remain forever in our grieving hearts, and may the moss which forever covers your blessed remains be soft and light to you like the caress of those who knew you," which is a very sweet way to kind of remember this awful death that is happening, because like I said, many of them are seeing the Germans shoot specifically these Jewish women that are leaving in these mass graves. They're seeing Jews and Russians frozen, shot, and then frozen, stuck to trees in the area. And it's just this very, very brutal, bloody scene. And then to return a second to the chaplain, Father Philippe, he states during this time, while he's in the Königsberg, while it's being laid siege with all this massive artillery, "I force myself to close my eyes, but my mind is working. And maybe I'm afraid, but that's not sure. We have been waiting for this moment for too long, and we were waiting for it as a punishment for those who held us in slavery. We are therefore out of the question. The shells are not for us the innocent, but for them the guilty." It was in this sort of unconsciousness that we walked among the fighters with sarcasm in our hearts. My mind works on practical things. I'm thinking of the hospital. I'm thinking that the hospital is well signposted during the day. However, it is not well signposted at night. How should it be reported during the night? I do not know. So just kind of another very interesting firsthand perspective of, you know, are we going to get killed because this hospital with all these POWs is not well marked and sign put? And then here's that quote kind of laid out if people want to read that. And then there's a picture of the chaplain, and then also kind of incredible that they had access to an altar in this camp. I'd not really seen that as being common at POW camps. And one last quote that I really like of the siege is by a man named Pauline Fouret. And he says, "The Russians, not far from us, treated us to the skillfully orchestrated concert of Stalin's organs. A rain of iron, fire, lightning, thunder streaked the tall pines of the forest and fell implacable around us and on us. In our very precarious shelters, we waited for the storm to end. Then timidly, we came out of our dens. Horrible spectacle that only the imagination can imagine. Dead people, injured people, all around us. And the priesthood of the living rushing to the slaughtered horses in search of a piece of flesh that we fought over, knife in hand. Sad degradation of the human personality, reduction of man towards bestiality due to the circumstances." So, remarkably, during all the starvation, death, and disease and bombings, the cemetery of Klein-Dexen would remain almost intact, and the chaplain notes that only 2 crosses were broken. And so this seems almost providential, and this is going to be incredibly useful for after the war for the men to make sense of what they just went through. So the second touchstone moment for these POWs, and that's critical to their remembrance, would be the Freischnierung Exodus. And as shown as a picture done by one of the POWs, and, you know, they're trying to show this immense chaos of trying to cross this ice while it's a very active war zone with all these bombings from the Russian Air Force and artillery and all that. So now, after kind of all this information about life as a POW on the Eastern Front and the East Prussian offensive and a little bit of the Holocaust and all this, let's turn to what life was like after captivity. So as I mentioned, most of the information from this presentation comes from Sudu 1A, which the Air Force Academy claims to have the only known collection in archival existence, although I'm sure there's much more on this camp that's out there. It just is not in the archives. And then these men go on to make their own ex-POW association called the Friends of the Belgian POWs of Stalag 1A, which later gets renamed the Friends of Stalag 1A. And they reach a subscriber membership numbering the thousands. They get millions of francs donated to help widows and other POWs who have illnesses that might not otherwise be covered by the government. And it's kind of similar to World War I memorials in that perspective, where communities really came together to be, how can we kind of help everyone who was so touched by this war and all this death and destruction? And then they mainly meet because, like the opening quote, they want to remember and document their experience, because after all, how else are we going to make sense of this intense suffering if we just all forget it? And so their main memorial, the National Memorial to Stalag 1A, is in Belgium. They started building in 1958, and then it was officially built in 1960. And they say that over 8,000 people attended, which is pretty good. And they're also able to get an urn with soil from the Kleindexen Cemetery in 1968, which is also quite remarkable. And the reason that they're able to get it is not because, mainly of the Soviet government or the French government, is because these veterans, these POWs, contact the Russian Veteran Association. And it is through the Russian Veteran Association, this communication that they establish, they're able to send it up the chain and get the soil of this intense site of suffering and pain back to Belgium. Yeah, and during the Cold War too, it's all quite amazing. And then it gets even more interesting because, they're actually able to exhume the French and Belgian POWs at the Kleindexen Cemetery in around 1970. And so the bodies are able to get back to the nations. However, the memorial ceremonies that the Friends of Stalag 1A did versus the national governments is much different. Like, instead of proudly parading, there is an element of we're proud of our nation, but the main focus is not, okay, this is French flag, this is a Belgian flag. They create their own flag, of Stalag 1A that they're very proud of. And then they also have their own medals, their own awards. And they create their own kind of national songs called like the March of Stalag 1A. And so the emphasis gets placed just as much of the people of Stalag 1A, which was all nationalities and all these different experiences, more so than we died because we did it for France or for Belgium. It was, there was death and suffering, but it was for freedom, which many nations deserve and want. And at the end of the day, we were all victims of fascism. And we have this incredible bond through our hardship and captivity. And what's also lastly interesting is that they go on these return trips after the war. They're able to go almost, I believe, 40 years later. And there's a picture of the men during their trip on the lower right. And then the lower left is a former site of the Stalag 1A camp, and then also with a memorial that the Russians or the Soviets erected in honor of all the POWs of all nationalities who survived Stalag 1A. And, this intense friendship, because they end up hanging out with the Russian veterans in Kaliningrad when they go to visit. And they even say that they claim, at least in their newspaper, that they're the first ones to celebrate the Great Patriotic War with the Russians on the actual day. So that's pretty interesting as well, is that it's not just friends with, the Belgians or the people from Luxembourg. We're also going to be friends with the Russians, because at the end of the day, while the Russians were at a different part of the camp, we're still very much acknowledging their pain and suffering that they went through, and that, there's solidarity there from our captivity. So while they started off fighting for the nation, they continued living for these bonds they kind of formed during captivity that included so many nations. And like I said, they justified their suffering all as victims of fascism and upholding universal right to freedom. And so, kind of lastly, I want to end with a quote by a POW, Maurice Mesters, about, kind of what's the point of all this. So instead of being silent, he's saying, well, no. On the contrary, our seeing is speaking for our own cause, for our dead comrades, but also for those who do not know, who did not experience the tragic hours. The past gives us a lesson. Let's share it with those who follow us, even if some find themselves embarrassed and would prefer silence. Above all, young people must know what war represents, not just the brilliant heroism that so many fields have glorified, not just those exhilarating moments of combat, of victory, of liberation, but also the bitterness of the retreat, the bombardments of defenseless cities, the terror of reprisals, the slow death where the spirit and body slide imperceptibly into the torpor of annihilation. Let young people know that the camps had their heroes, those who never capitulated, who knew how to resist asphyxiation, who believed until the end. We know all this, but who will tell them after us? And so they say that kind of encapsulates their sentiments of why they go on to write for decades all these articles about their experience. It's because, you know, similar to many other victims of horror and suffering, is that by speaking out and remembering, it's kind of this act of protest against all this atrocity that has happened. So thank you and for your time and attention. And yeah, I'm looking forward to questions, and feel free to ever message me on X, you know, the artist formerly known as Twitter as well.
Wow, brilliant stuff. I've got loads of questions. And I think the viewers will have some as well. So first one is, do you have a conclusion or a theory as to why religion seemed to be a stronger aspect in that camp than others? I mean, I've read a lot about you know, Colditz and Stalag Luft 3 and what have you, and it seems that it was sort of a secondary thing. They run on maybe more military lines. In fact, at Colditz, you know, was it Colditz? One of the camps, you know, the church is where they kind of dig a tunnel from or something. It's almost seen as like an escape opportunity rather than a means of expressing kind of personal faith. So have you got a conclusion?
I think it's really helpful that they did have these really knowledgeable priests, like traditionally trained Catholic priests in camp to draw on. I just think that type of leadership is so great. And then I also think the Catholic Church has a lot of frameworks for how to deal with suffering. I mean, obviously, Easter was recent, you know, the passion of Jesus, and you're going to take on all this suffering. You're going to bear your cross because it's for the good of everyone else. I think that narrative fits in incredibly well with the POW experience of captivity. And I think with a trained theologian, they're actually able to answer maybe a lot of questions that these men have. But yeah, no, I think it's so interesting. I'm surprised, like you said, a lot of other POW camps, religion is more tertiary. It's not.
Yeah. Were there, do we know if there were any kind of senior military figures in the camp? You know, there obviously some of the camps, they have a senior British officer, because people within that confines are looking for some sort of leadership. So it could come from the military, it could come from priests, it could come from outside that. Were the priests therefore, in a sense, the highest ranking people there?
You know, I haven't thought of it like that, but that's a great way to put that. They could be seen as kind of a higher ranking, great person to lean on, because all the officers got sent out, you know, to Colditz, to Stalag Luft 3, to these specifically officer camps. So these are kind of more regular enlisted men. But what's also interesting is that they have such a strong bond, even though a lot of them were at different work sites, right? Because a lot of them were in different commandos at farms and all that. They weren't all in the main camp. But they were still able to come together in kind of this incredible way.
Well, we'll definitely touch on the bonds. That's another question I want to ask you. But a couple from viewers. So Scott Grimwood is saying, what is left of Stalag 1A now? Is there anything at all left in the area?
Yeah, no, thanks, Scott. That's a great question. To me, it just looks like it's mainly forest and ruins. It hasn't really been preserved except for that one monument that the Soviets did erect to kind of be like, people were here, there was death and suffering, you know, end of story.
Yeah, I feel it's the same. And then another question from Michael Dunn. Did the POWs eventually fall under the control of the Soviets? And if so, how did the Soviets treat them? Obviously, there are Soviet prisoners there already, but what about the Belgians and the French and the others who were there?
Yeah, so these POWs did eventually fall under the control of the Soviets, which originally led me to look at this collection at the Air Force Academy, because I was really interested in how does POW treatment differ, if at all, if the Russians liberate Allied POWs versus the Americans or the British. And everything I've read has shown just a very nice, good standard of treatment. I haven't seen anything that was bad. It all seemed relatively straightforward. I mean, it took them a couple months upon being liberated by the Russians in order to get back to Belgium or France, which is kind of a long time. But everything seems to me above board. I know, they even have some articles where they address, like, are there any Belgians or Frenchmen still left in the Soviet Union? Like, was there anyone who was left behind? And the men themselves come to the conclusion of, no, we don't think so. And even, if you're more interested in the topic, Forgotten Bastards of the Eastern Front is a really interesting book by Sari Plotky, where he kind of talks about what is the American-British experience. This is in Ukraine, but working with the Soviets and kind of dealing with liberation over there.
Well, thank you for that. And my next question is really about the extraordinary bond that, as you said, they're not even necessarily in the same compound, but yet there was this bond there. And because we as human beings tend to associate in groups of people who are similar to us. That's kind of the echo chambers of social media. We kind of reject people who have different views to ourselves and live in it. And, we think of this national divide in POW camps. But I've read books where actually it was more of an attitude, in that the quiet ones ended up in one heart and the social ones another heart, and the people who wanted to read would end up congregating together. And that would sort of happen over the nations. Have you got any theories about, well, firstly, how did the bonds establish, and why were they particularly strong at this particular camp?
Yeah, I think part of the reason, like I said, is partly this Catholicism. That would make a lot of sense, kind of the shared ritual that is able to happen to kind of transfigure the suffering that they're going through. Also, what was probably incredibly bonding was that they were actually allowed to have funeral processions at the Kleindexen Cemetery. So 20 POWs were allowed to form a procession per each man that they were burying. And so, you can, if, multiple people are friends with them and you have French, Belgium, all these nationalities forming the procession for someone who's dead, that's incredibly bonding, because once again, that's very unusual that they get a memorialization procession in the first place. So I think this kind of unity around death and being able to return to a cemetery, which is like, okay, all nationalities are buried here, it's not just us. And the fact that the guards allowed them to even visit and pray at the cemetery, it's just all very interesting policies from this camp that probably leads in part to this exceptionalism in the bond.
And also, I guess, certainly in 1945, but earlier, they're completely in the war zone. There are some prisoner of war camps where, although the suffering is there and the cruelty can be there, the war is quite distant. But this, in this area, they are there. That, as you said yourself, the Holocaust is just around the corner. The bombing is just there. So that going through that experience of the war being still very relevant and still very active. Whereas there are, as I said, there are some prisoners of war camps where they're miles away from any action until towards the liberation, where maybe the outlook was more kind of insular and thinking about themselves. And whereas in this environment, maybe there's more of an attitude of a collective understanding and sympathy for other people, because you're seeing it. And maybe if you're Belgian, you're being treated to some level of degradation, but you're seeing others around you being treated worse. So that there's an empathy and sympathy coming in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that makes total sense. And then also how they were able to come together after the war and continuously reinforce that we have a bond and that we remember, I think also kind of lends to this exceptionalism, because, most organizations can't last a fortnight under poor leadership, let alone decades. And so I think they had some very key leaders in the Friends of Stalag 1A that really helped for this to become such a transnational bond.
No, definitely. I mean, everything you've said here seems to be different to what I've read about the POW experience, and I should just say, not just the POW experience of Allies, prisoners of the Axis, but also of American, German POWs in America, which I've read about as well, for example, or Japanese prisoners held in Australia. There's something seems to be quite unique about this, which makes it fascinating, and the fact that it's an area that it clearly, apart from this newsletter that you've had access to, it hasn't been talked about much in the last 20 or 30 years. It was a big thing for these people who went through it. And what else? These archives obviously a starting point. Is this a subject you're going to carry on with, this particular aspect? Is there more documentation? I mean, obviously you've got all these things you said you're going to be up to learning in Russian and going and doing the Holocaust studies, but is this aspect going to keep drawing you?
I'm sure I could go either way. I originally envisioned this becoming a really great journal article to talk about kind of this transnationalism that we can use to view the POW experience. Because like I said, in history and specifically in nationalism history, it's such a big issue of how can we view people apart from the nation that they're from. And so looking at kind of this more entangled history of these bonds they chose to make, I thought would just be a very interesting journal article. But I am meeting with an editor at SMH who's interested in this becoming a book potentially on remembrance and transnationalism and how people make sense of it. I'm not sure if I'm going to embark on that project and that journey, but I will be having that conversation.
Well, there's a few people watching, I think, who will be hoping you do make that journey, because there's nothing better than history that tells us about the past, but also tells us something about ourselves today, and this how we bond in adversity, and how we can align with people from different civilizations and cultures who have different views to us, and yet find these areas of common interests and common understanding. But a couple more questions are coming in. So what was it? I've lost it there. What happened to the camp's priest? So the particular priest you were talking about earlier on, Scott is saying what happened to him, or all of them?
Well, all of them were able to survive after the war and to return, which is incredible. I was only able to highlight just one priest in the presentation, but there was obviously many more. And so actually at these days of remembrance that the POWs had, post-war, they would have regional days of remembrance, but there was also national days of remembrance. And so the ex-POW priests would give the homilies when they would hold mass for those who had fallen a mass of remembrance. And so they very much interacted with these priests well after the war, looked to them for guidance. And the priests also made some art, which was quite interesting about the experiences.
Thank you for that. And then a question from Susan Yu, who is a brigadier on Patreon. So just a reminder, folks, you can always support us on Patreon. So Susan is one of two brigadiers at the highest level. Anyway, she's saying, who was responsible for maintaining the camp, cooking, cleaning, etc.? Was there slave labor? Because again, in my experience at POW camps, sometimes prisoners kind of do their own cooking. They give rations to huts, or they give rations to compounds. Sometimes it's provided by the captors. And so what do you know about Stalag Luft 1A in this regard?
Mm-hmm. Well, I know the POWs considered themselves as slave labor. They wrote about that a lot, having to dig trenches, having to dig graves, having to work on these agricultural farms. Sometimes they worked, over 80 hours a week, some of them, right? And, maybe they got Sunday off, maybe they didn't. But they certainly, some of them consider themselves that to be a form of slave labor. In terms of what was actually happening in the Eternal Main Camp, I'm not too sure on what the cooking procedures were like and all that. From what I have read about kind of the food intake, it seems there was not much cooking happening. It was either going to be prepackaged, or like, here's a potato or some like boiled, maybe pea soup. But is it pea soup? I don't know. So the nutrition was not wildly fantastic.
Yeah, and I mean, we talked before going live, Holly, about the fact that the plight of POWs generally has been brought back into focus from Masters of the Air, because as a Brit, as I said to you earlier, we're brought up with this idea of it always being summer and people seem to be fit and jumping around all the time and trying to escape, and yet the actual universal POW experience, Allied axis across the world, is often framed through hardship and lack of food and freezing cold or high heat if you're in the tropics. And so that aspect, I think, is going to come through. So we need more information about just the day-to-day living under these conditions. But one particular question from Bruce Day is asking, you kind of touched on this, but a little bit more explained, how are the POWs segregated and how was segregation enforced? Because that's another aspect, is that compounds and huts could be locked down at night, but there may be some freedom to move around the day. Have you got any kind of understanding of how it all worked?
No, thank you, Bruce, for that question. And so all of the kind of more Western Allied POWs were kind of kept together. So the French, British, there was a few British, but not that many, Luxembourgish and Belgians. And then there was a separate part of the camp that was heavily enclosed in barbed wire. And that also had its own hospital that was just for the Russians. And, so one Western Allied POWs of Stalag 1A comment a lot on seeing, a lot of bodies come out of the Russian section often. And if the gates were opening or closing over there, it was usually only for death. It was not for any good news whatsoever. And then also to your kind of point earlier about POWs and kind of this myth that everything was kind of sunnier, cheerier, kind of more Hogan's Heroes-esque. There's some really interesting history that's tackling this issue of myth and memory, and kind of what the going theory is that, when people are selecting war memoirs or war narratives, they're only going to really select or amplify ones that are in line with the existing myth. And so that's kind of why these other counter narratives kind of get disregarded and left to dusty bookshelves, is because they're just not going to get selected for in like the popular memory. And then Nietzsche would also kind of agree with that, where he's saying people are only going to take from my books what makes sense to them. And so it's kind of this issue of how are we going to make sense of kind of all this other messy, complicated stuff that's happening.
Thank you. Wonderful answer to that. One from Fred. Fred is asking, any information about the origin of Soviet prisoners, since the German policy was to kill or starve ethnic Slavs during and after Operation Barbarossa? Another really good point there, because we do tend to think of a more murderous attitude towards the Soviets. So obviously these ones here are not captured in, well, I'm assuming they're not captured in Barbarossa. They're captured more in the area. So any idea about that?
No, thank you, Fred. Actually, from what I've read, is these came from Operation Barbarossa. These Soviet POWs ended up at the camp. I mean, it's also like the same with the Polish POWs that are there. It's like, well, we didn't think the Germans took really many Polish POWs in kind of popular memory, and yet here they are, select few for both of them in comparison to the size of the army. I'm not sure quite what the decision-making process was on, which Soviet or Polish POWs to keep versus others. I don't know if it was random at a more operational level. I'm sure there's probably German literature that's out there on it. I'm not quite sure.
I would have to get someone who knows perhaps about the Einsatzen group and that, whether there was some kind of policy, whether the Wehrmacht were involved or the SS were involved. But then it is interesting that there was a difference between, where, depending on where you were captured, what your fate would be, and at what time of the war, I guess, as well. But
no, exactly. I mean, to me, it makes sense that you would be incentivized to keep POWs just because, a young man that's reasonably able-bodied is going to be great labor for whatever you want to set him to. So there seems to be a clear incentive to keep them.
Yeah, I think another fab question from Scott Grimwood there. You are coming out with some good questions, folks, today. Is what about Red Cross support for this camp, since it's POWs from occupied countries? Because obviously the Red Cross and their influence, countless thousands of POWs were kept alive through the actions of the Red Cross and the inspections by the. Do we know about visits to the Red Cross to this camp?
Yeah, no, thank you, Scott, for that question. So the Red Cross was able to visit this camp. Specifically, they were able to do visits in more 1941, 42, 43, kind of these earlier years in the war. And they remarked, the reports I've read have been pretty brief. They're like, oh, the camp seems suitable. Like, these guys are doing their best, type of thing. But like with any aid that's just kind of given throughout World War II, a large percentage of it, it's just never going to get distributed to the POWs. The Germans will hoard it in, huge caches away from the camp. It's kind of like stockpiles. But they did, inevitably get Red Cross parcels that were great for help and for nutrition. It's to the extent that it should have been no. And then especially, during 1945 and kind of these last 12 months of the war, when the Red Cross official visits really stopped, right? Because it's such an active war zone. People can't get over there and document and make sure the supply chain is running to the camps, because, that's not a supply chain people are particularly pressed about, during this big siege. So it depends on what part of the war. But
well, that's the irony, isn't it? Is that the Red Cross tended to have better access when the camp was less in need of their help.
Yeah.
Although they're always in need of some help, than when things get bad. That's through the circumstances of the camp battles getting closer. The Red Cross were unable to visit. So you see that across Europe with the POW camps. But my last question for you before we kind of bring things to end is You talked about the importance and significance of religion and faith to these prisoners. In reading the newsletters, what about humor? What about that kind of laughing in the face of adversity? Because we do, I know, you name checked Hogan's Heroes, and obviously that's a very silly version of POW, but you do read accounts of any kind of captivity, even in some of the Holocaust, of their finding these things to laugh at and things to kind of bond over. That is there evidence of that in the newsletters?
Unfortunately, the stuff I've read, the humor is not stuck out to me. It could just be the French and Belgians have a different sense of humor than what I do, but it's all just been extremely serious. And they actually bring up in multiple articles, like, we take issue with kind of these pop culture representations that are happening of POW.
Interesting.
Yeah, because it was so significant, our suffering and experience, and it's kind of getting, relegated to the side with these other perspectives, because at the end of the day, memory is a business. And their kind of memory of suffering is just not maybe as profitable as the memory of Stalag 3 or Hogan's Heroes or camps like that.
I mean, that's a really good point. I feel I remember when in the 1970s we had the series Colditz came out in Britain.
Yeah.
I still love it, and David McCallum from NCIS was in it, and others. But I do remember there was some feedback from still living POWs saying it wasn't about escape all the time, and this presented a kind of an upper class version of it all, and that the experience presented on the screen was not entirely fair. And clearly across the world there have been, I mean, the French have made movies about POW camps and prisons as well, and so have many nations. We probably kind of forgotten that now, because the veterans generation is mostly gone now. We perhaps look back at the films like Great Escape and the Colditz Story and even Hogan's Heroes affectionately, but maybe at the time there was much more from some quarters backlash against those things, which is from within these kind of associations, which is interesting.
Yeah, and then kind of also another interesting point is that, with these kind of more popular ones, like, The Great Escape with Stalag 3 and all that, it's kind of this monetary value of investment that's going into POWs. Like, it costs much more to train a pilot who becomes a POW than, for example, an infantryman. I know I was reading some American intelligence reports, and they were saying they spent on average $40,000 per pilot, and this is in the 40s, right, to train an American pilot. And so that's why MISX, which was a escape and evasion intelligence group for Americans, was so invested in specifically getting pilot POWs back and getting them to escape.
Which makes sense on a practical winning the war level, but doesn't feel quite so good if you happen to be in a camp and all the efforts are being made to get, Johnny the fighter pilot out when you were a poor bloody infantry captured 2 years old, and someone doesn't feel that your life somehow is worth as much, which in monetary value, it kind of wasn't in terms of winning the war, because as you said, a pilot or a skilled job it's an interesting, complicated subject for further discussion. But Holly, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you. I feel we're all going to watch your career soar over the next few years, and I can say I knew her when. So it's fantastic. People love it when we bring on people at your stage of your career, as well as the crusty old grey-haired historians we bring on, who are the kind of the bedrock of the channel. It's important we bring through the younger people. You get the blood, the new talent in terms of explaining about the war. So thank you very much.
No, thank you so much for having me, Paul, and to everyone who watched, thank you. It's such a privilege to be able to do history, and it's an even greater privilege to be able to share kind of what I'm locked away in my room reading and documenting and trying to make sense of. So this is just a great platform to work out my thoughts and hopefully leave information for you all to take away with.
Well, brilliant. Well, people have said how much they've learned. So, folks, I'm back again tomorrow. Unusual time. It's 11 a.m. UK time. We're talking to David Stahl over in Australia about these 4 Panzer generals and the correspondence they had with their wives, and we'll get some insight into Guderian and these other figures. So I'm looking forward to that. And then there's a break till Wednesday will be my next show. Folks, thank you very much for your support. Don't forget to click like and subscribe. Follow the books of my guests. Follow their websites. Follow them on social media. And I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Have a good final part of Sunday. Bye.